Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. It's great to have you all back with us for part 14 of our series. Remember, we're going through the Bible chapter by chapter. Sometimes we even do thematic studies. But the goal is to make these ancient stories exciting and relevant, especially for our young adult listeners. Today, we are opening up Genesis 14. And this chapter is really interesting because it throws us right into the middle of battles and alliances. And we even encounter a mysterious figure named Melchizedek.
Yeah, what's fascinating about Genesis 14 is that it really takes us back to a time of kings and kingdoms, a world that might feel distant to our own. We're talking about the ancient Near East, a region where power was constantly shifting, alliances were fragile, and battles were just a way of life.
Yeah, it's like stepping into a historical epic.
Okay.
The chapter starts off with this list of kings: Amraphel, Arioch, Kedorlaomer. Try saying that one 3 times fast.
Yeah.
We also have Tidal, Bera, Bersha, Shinab, Shemeber, and even the king of Bela, who we find out later is also called Zoar. It's like a lot of names to keep track of. Are all these names really that important to understand what's going on?
Well, they do show us the political landscape of the time. All these names represent different kingdoms and alliances, and it highlights this complex web of relationships that existed in the ancient Near East, for instance. The Valley of Siddim, where a key battle takes place, is described as being full of tar pits. And that detail alone gives you a sense of how brutal and unforgiving this world could be.
It definitely paints a very vivid picture. So we've got this king, Kedorlaomer, who seems to be kind of calling all the shots. He's got a bunch of other kings under his control, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, which, if you remember from the earlier chapters, they aren't exactly known for their righteousness.
Yeah.
But after 12 years
Yeah.
of being under Kedorlaomer's thumb,
They decide to rebel. Exactly, and this rebellion sets off a chain reaction of battles. Kedorlaomer and his allies march from victory to victory, defeating groups like the Rephates, Zuzites, Emites, Horites, Amalekites, and Amorites. It's almost like a whirlwind tour of the different peoples that inhabited this region at the time.
I have to admit, whenever I hit those long lists of names in the Bible, my eyes kind of glaze over. How do you make sense of all those different groups? And does it even matter for us today?
It's a fair question, and I think it's okay to feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of names. But remember, each of these names represents a people group with their own history and culture. They're not just random entries in a historical record, but they are a reminder of the complexity and the diversity of the ancient world.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like each name adds a little more detail to the tapestry of the story, even if we don't necessarily have to memorize them all. But amidst all this political turmoil, our main character, Abram, gets pulled into this conflict. His nephew, Lot, who's been living in Sodom, gets captured in the crossfire.
And this is where things get really interesting. We see Abram, who we know will become Abraham, the father of many nations, step up in a way that reveals a lot about his character.
Absolutely. He doesn't even hesitate to go after Lot, even though, let's be honest, Lot had made some questionable choices by settling in Sodom. But what really caught my eye was this detail that Abram gathers 318 trained men from his household to go fight. 318. That's a pretty impressive fighting force for a nomadic patriarch.
Right. It challenges our assumptions about Abram. He's not just a wandering shepherd with a few sheep. He's a man of influence and resources. And the fact that he has 318 trained men suggests a level of wealth and organization that we might not expect.
So Abram leads this rescue mission, and against all odds, he actually wins. He defeats Kedorlaomer's forces, rescues Lot and the other captives, and returns home victorious. But then, just when you think the chapter's winding down, we get this really strange encounter with Melchizedek.
Melchizedek is one of those figures in the Bible who appears very briefly, but leaves a lasting impact. He's described as the king of Salem, which some scholars believe is the ancient city of Jerusalem, and a priest of God Most High.
Yeah, he kind of pops up out of nowhere, blesses Abram, and then Abram gives him a tenth of everything he's recovered. Such a mysterious moment. Who exactly is Melchizedek, and what does it mean that Abram, this man of faith, honors him in such a way?
Well, that's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Some see Melchizedek as a foreshadowing of Christ, a priestly king who represents God's ultimate authority. Others see him as a symbol of the priesthood that would later be established through Aaron. There's really no definitive answer, which makes this passage all the more intriguing.
That's like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit, but in a good way. Makes you think about God's interaction with people outside of Abram's lineage and how this encounter might connect to the bigger story of God's plan for humanity.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the key takeaways from this passage. It challenges us to consider how God might be working in unexpected places. And through unexpected people, even in a world filled with conflict and chaos, God is present, and his purposes are being worked out.
Okay, so we've got battles, alliances, a mysterious priest-king. Genesis 14 is definitely packed with action and intrigue. But before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, I want to focus on one more detail that stood out to me. Abram's refusal to accept any reward from the king of Sodom.
That's a really important moment. The king of Sodom, grateful to be rescued, offers Abram all the goods that had been recovered. But Abram says, "I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich."
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. Why do you think Abram was so adamant about refusing any reward from the king of Sodom?
Well, I think it speaks to Abram's understanding of where his true provision comes from. He knows that God is his provider, his protector, and his ultimate source of blessing.
So he's drawing a clear line
Mm-hmm.
between the values of the world, represented by the king of Sodom, and the values of the kingdom of God. It's like he's saying, my loyalty and my trust are in God, and not in earthly wealth or power.
Right. And this refusal highlights a theme that we see throughout the Bible: the importance of integrity and faithfulness, even when it's difficult or costly. Abram could have easily taken the reward, but he understood that true wealth and blessing come from God, not from compromising his values.
It's a powerful challenge for us, isn't it? How often do we find ourselves tempted to compromise our own values or our relationship with God for personal gain or comfort?
That's a question worth reflecting on, and it's something that we'll continue to unpack as we move on to part 2 of our deep dive into Genesis 14.
So what stood out to you about this part of Genesis 14? Let us know in the comments. And be sure to stick around for part 2, where we'll explore the deeper meaning and implications of Abram's encounter with Melchizedek and his refusal of the king of Sodom's reward.
And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/Radio WBCM to stay updated with all of our latest episodes and deep dives into the Word.
Radio WBCM.
Welcome back to Bible Talks on WBCM Radio. We're diving deeper into Genesis 14. And I'm still thinking about that fascinating encounter between Abram and Melchizedek. It's just such a brief moment in the text, but it revisits so many questions about God's work in the world.
It's amazing how these ancient stories can pack so much meaning into just a few verses. And Melchizedek is one of those figures who continues to intrigue and inspire even thousands of years later.
You know, as we talked about in the last part, some scholars see Melchizedek as a foreshadowing of Christ, a priestly king who embodies both spiritual and temporal authority. What do you think about that interpretation?
It's definitely a compelling idea. If we look at how Melchizedek is described, he's called the King of Righteousness and the King of Peace, titles that resonate with the way Jesus is portrayed in the New Testament.
Right, and the fact that he's also a priest adds another layer to that connection. Jesus is often described as our high priest, the one who intercedes for us before God the Father.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the idea of Melchizedek foreshadowing Christ, it raises some really interesting questions about the scope of God's plan for salvation. Remember, Melchizedek appears before the establishment of the covenant with Abraham, and he's not even part of Abraham's lineage.
So does that mean that God's saving grace extends beyond the boundaries of Israel, even before the coming of Jesus?
That's a question that many theologians have grappled with. Some argue that Melchizedek's appearance suggests a broader understanding of God's work in the world, a work that encompasses all of humanity, not just a chosen people.
I find that idea really encouraging. It speaks to God's universal love and his desire to reconcile all people to himself, regardless of their background or ethnicity. It's a message that's especially relevant in our increasingly diverse and interconnected world.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that Abram recognizes Melchizedek's authority and gives him a tenth of everything he's recovered. This act of giving foreshadows the principle of tithing that would later become a central practice in the Israelite faith.
So it's not just about acknowledging Melchizedek as a priest, but it's about honoring God and acknowledging his provision in Abram's life.
Precisely. And this act of giving points to a broader theme that we see throughout Genesis 14, the contrast between Abram and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah.
You're right. I hadn't thought about it that way. But their responses to the battle are completely different. The king of Sodom is focused on material wealth and dividing the spoils of war, while Abram is concerned with honoring God and upholding his values.
It's like they're operating from two completely different worldviews. The king of Sodom represents this materialistic and self-serving perspective, while Abram represents this faith-driven and God-centered perspective.
And this contrast is highlighted even further when Abram refuses to accept any reward from the king of Sodom. Remember, he says, I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. It's such a powerful statement about where Abram places his trust and his allegiance.
It's a reminder that true wealth and security come from God, not from earthly possessions, or the approval of worldly powers. Abram understands that his ultimate provision comes from the one who created heaven and earth.
And his refusal also speaks to his integrity. He could have easily taken the reward, but he knows that true blessing comes from living in alignment with God's will, not from compromising his values for the sake of personal gain.
Exactly, and I think that's a challenge for us today as well. How often do we find ourselves tempted to compromise our values or our relationship with God for the sake of success, comfort, or acceptance?
It's so easy to get caught up in the pursuit of worldly things, to believe that our worth is tied to our accomplishments or our possessions. But Abram's example reminds us that our true identity and our true security are found in God alone.
And his story encourages us to live with that kind of faith and integrity, to seek God's kingdom first and trust that he will provide for our needs.
So as we reflect on this part of Genesis 14, what resonates with you most? Is it the mysterious encounter with Melchizedek, the contrast between Abram and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, or Abram's refusal to compromise his values? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
WBCM.
Welcome back to Bible Talks on WBCM Radio for the final part of our deep dive into Genesis 14. As we've been unpacking this chapter, one theme keeps coming up for me. The idea of living with integrity in a world that often pulls us in different directions. That's a really important theme. And it's something that's just as relevant today as it was back in Abram's time. We live in a world that often values success, power, and material wealth above all else. And it can be so tempting to compromise our values or our relationship with God, just for the sake of fitting in or getting ahead.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with these messages telling us that we need to be more, do more, have more. And it's easy to start believing that our worth is tied to those things. But Abram's story challenges us to think differently.
Absolutely. Abram shows us that true success isn't measured by worldly standards, but by our faithfulness to God and our commitment to living with integrity, even when it's difficult or costly.
Remember how he refused to accept any reward from the king of Sodom? He could have easily taken the spoils of war, but he knew that true blessing comes from God, not from compromising his values.
That moment really highlights a key difference between Abram and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were driven by greed, power, and self-preservation, while Abram was guided by a higher purpose, his relationship with God.
It's like they were speaking two different languages. The kings were speaking the language of the world, while Abram was speaking the language of faith.
Exactly, and I think that's a distinction that we need to be aware of in our own lives. Are we allowing the values of the world to dictate our choices? Or are we seeking to live in alignment with God's will, even when it means going against the grain?
It's interesting to think about Melchizedek in this context as well. Here's this mysterious priest king who appears out of nowhere, blesses Abram, and receives a tenth of everything Abram has recovered.
And that act of giving, as we talked about earlier, foreshadows the principle of tithing that would later become central to the Israelite faith. It's a reminder that everything we have ultimately belongs to God, and we're called to be good stewards of those blessings.
It's not just about giving back a portion of our income, but it's about recognizing that our whole lives are a gift from God, and we are called to use our time, talents, and resources to honor Him and to bless others.
That's a powerful perspective shift. It's not about what we can get from the world, but how we can use what we have to make a difference and advance God's purposes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 14, I want to leave you with this question to ponder. What does it look like for you to live with integrity in your everyday life? What choices are you facing that require you to put your faith into action, even if it means sacrificing something that you value?
Those are questions worth wrestling with. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. We have the example of Abram, the promises of God, and the power of the Holy Spirit to guide and strengthen us.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Genesis 14. We hope it's challenged you to think differently about faith, integrity, and the true meaning of success. And remember, you can find new episodes of Bible Talks on WBCM Radio every week, on our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com at Radio WBCM, and on all your favorite podcast platforms.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with all of our latest episodes and deep dives into the Word. We're also really passionate about sharing great Christian music, so be sure to check out our channel for reviews and recommendations.
Until next time,
Bye.
may you be blessed as you seek to live a life that honors God in all that you do.
Radio